Hi, welcome to the tutorial for the OLFT engine. It's been about a year since I first released the program, so I felt like this might be a little late. Anyway, I felt it was only fair to make a pretty simple tutorial about the base version of the engine. I will make a more advanced tutorial on deeper topics later, but for now I think it's going to be important to just run through the basics, so this video will mostly cover the description of the program itself. In order to get anything out of the template though, you will need to know the basics of how to design maps in the level editor, along with how some of the basic systems within the game work. So, first things first, how does it work? The OLFT engine is a raycaster, meaning it casts mathematical rays in a 2D environment in order to create the impression that the environment is drawn in 3D. To keep it simple, it basically draws each vertical line of pixels by projecting a ray from the camera until it hits a wall, and then uses that information to draw a vertical line. From that information, it also draws the floor and ceiling, and then draws the objects on top of it. Alright, so now onto the main topic of the video, how to use the actual level editor that is built into the program. It's actually fairly simple when you get to know the program, but if you're new to it, it can be a little bit confusing, so that's why I'm making this video. First thing you're going to want to do, you're going to scroll down from the start of the description all the way down to the game variable where it says DevTools. That's on line 75. If you change that from false to true, you'll get these new tools on the top of the screen inside the game. So these tools are pretty important for the game itself, at least when it comes to editing levels. So on the left up here, if you can see my cursor, you have a couple of different things that show you things about the game. So the top leftmost one, the topmost one, about 30 right now, that's the frame rate, how many frames per second you're getting. It's how the game calculates it. Underneath that is the global timer. It's a timer that counts up from 0 to 1000 and then resets. A lot of things in the game can use that. Things like animations and I guess weapon cooldowns. Usually they don't use that, they're stored in their own variable. But mostly anything that needs to just have a global time, maybe like a random element. Underneath that is the player's exact X and Y coordinates, except they're rounded down to their whole number. This is pretty useful for knowing where exactly you are on the in the level, what square you're occupying on the grid. Aside from that, you're just going to use it to see whether you're moving or not. And then underneath that is the name of the level that you're in. So this one is called Intersection. Now to the right is basically your dev tools. These are the things that you can modify to help make the levels or just test them. So next I want to tell you about the key bindings for these tools. So the top right, you can see the first one is no clip, and then from there it's semi-pause, then cam, which is for camera, what camera type you're on. Then underneath that is type, which is the type of tool that you're using. And then underneath that is index, which is the specific number that the tool is using. It's kind of hard to explain without actually showing you how it works, so I'll get into that. The reason why I pointed out that they're in that order is because when you're using the key bindings, they are in that order. So what I'm talking about, if you go up to the top of your keyboard on the right side, the letters I, O, P, open bracket, and then close bracket, those correspond to those tools. So I, if you press I, it toggles on and off no clip. If you can see that when I press I, it does that. No clip lets you walk through walls. That's about all it does, and I think I made it so that if like enemies in flat life are solid, you walk through them too. That helps with designing levels. Next is semi-pause, which means that any object that would move in the game no longer does, except for the player. So if I was to launch a projectile, it would move across the screen like that. But if I press O while it's flying, it'll stop moving. And it'll stop gaining speed and all that stuff. Basically, it turns off the physics for most objects, except for the player. And then I can see it fly by me. Then underneath that is the camera variable. Right now it's set to 2, and there are 3 different types of camera. This is actually the last one. It's the default one, but it's the highest on the scale. So pressing bracket changes that. Now the reason why I don't press P to do that is because P is actually its own thing, but you can't see it usually. Um, let's skip that for now and just use bracket. So if you press bracket, the open bracket one, that brings you to this camera angle, which is the top-down view that is static. It does not rotate. If you press bracket again, it brings you to the rotating top-down view. This really doesn't have much of a purpose. You're probably not going to use this very often. It's only for testing, aiming from above while you're not, I guess, in first person for some reason. It's just there for convenience, but I'm not sure where exactly you would use it. So this one, then this one, it just loops through them. Back to the static one. This is the only one that you can edit the level in. If you try to edit the level in either camera modes 1 or 2, it's not going to work. This one is the only one that you can click and then place down stuff, so just make sure that if you think for some reason game isn't working, you're not able to edit the levels, just make sure you're in camera mode 0. So, the thing I was talking about, the letter P. If you press P on the keyboard, it does do something for the DevTools. It's just not shown on the heads-up display because it's kind of not very important. It toggles on and off the grid lines that I have put down to help it make it easier to see stuff. This might just be used to more clearly see a bunch of objects that you're placing down, or kind of remove the clutter with the lines, or even slow down some of the lag if it's a larger level, but it probably won't be that much use to you. So, now that I have all that out of the way, we can start with the actual tools themselves. So, you start with no clip off, you start with semi-pause off, you start with camera in 2, then you change it to 0 to start editing the level. And then from there, the only other key that you press for the DevTools themselves is bracket. That resets the level for you and places the character back at the start, basically reloading the level. It tells the game to load the level and then as if you had just entered it or started the game from there. So next up, we have the actual keys for the tools themselves. So notice how underneath camera, type and index also have 0 and 0. Now these are the different types of tools. Type is the type of tool, and index is the number that that tool is using. So, type 0 is the tool that you use to change the layout of the level. That means the walls, what the walls look like. So right now you can see that a bunch of the walls are 1s and a bunch of the walls are 2. You can tell by the actual number inside of the wall itself. If you press K, no, not K, sorry. If you click, that's the key that you use, that's the button you press to edit the level, it will replace the grid that you're clicking on with the index, not the type that you have selected. So right now I have index 0, and that is all the empty space. So if I was to press 0 on this, it would delete it. And if I jump back into the first-person camera, you can see that the wall itself is gone. Thing to note here, though, I can still walk into this, and it is still a solid object. This is me walking towards it, so I'm stuck. This is intentional. This is part of the way that the level is designed, and I will start explaining that in a minute. But right now, index is what I'm trying to explain. So first, if you wanted to get that wall back, notice that the other walls are 2, so you might want to set that back as 2. If you press, look down at the keyboard, it is the less than and greater than sign. If you use those as kind of arrow keys, you can change the index itself. So if you press 2, and you click, ta-da, it's back. And you can do that anywhere and add walls wherever you want. These will not be solid since they are just the walls themselves, not the solid objects that you run into. I'll get into that in a second, but if you notice, these are hedges. and these are actual walls, and the number determines what texture you are using. So in the template that I give you, I'll probably have textures like these that you can place down and use for your own games, whatever you decide to make. So from there, now that you understand how the tools themselves work, we can move on to how to move through the different tools and what each tool does. So the first one, tool 0, type 0, as it's displayed, that is the walls. If you want to get to the next one, you can use the K and L keys the same way that you use the less than or greater than symbols to move around. You can use those to change the tool type. These are the boundaries, what was actually stopping you. Each wall that I've put in, I've also put in a boundary on. This is a pretty static type of tool, I guess you could call it, in that 0 means that there is not a boundary there that you can walk through, and 1 means there is one that you cannot walk through. So if I press 1 here, even though there is not an object there, it creates a boundary and I cannot walk through it. It only affects that grid space though, so that's just kind of handy if you want to section off players from going places you don't want them to, even if you don't want to put a wall there, or if you want to make some walls move throughable. So the index of 0 lets you delete a boundary, basically, and that would let me walk into the wall and then out through the other side in the same path that I showed there, so you could walk through it. If you have no clip on, though, it ignores these boundaries and then just lets you walk through them anyway. So, next tool on the list is tool number 2. This is the floor, I believe. This changes what you see on the floor. So 1 in this case is a type of just kind of pathway that you can see on the ground there. And as you make these changes, they are being kind of like saved in the game's variable for what is the level. 1 is the floors, and then 2 is something similar, I think, inside the buildings. So that would be like the ground inside the sheds over here, like this. By the way, something that I kind of neglected to mention, the index, the actual little tool that you see there, the number, it carries over between the different tools. So if you're building, say, a wall that is 2, like that, and then you go to the floor, it will also still be on 2. So the index doesn't change unless you go to lighting, which is a separate index itself, which I will get into in a second. This one, tool 3, tool type 3, is the same as the floor, but it's just the ceiling. It works the same way. You're probably going to use them in the same places, but if not, it's just kind of a way of separating them. So you can just kind of see the same kind of thing that I was using before. This would be the inside type thing. If you don't I should have mentioned this before, but if you don't have a floor or a ceiling in an area, the game will put the color of the background or the skybox and the floor box instead. So you kind of get a placeholder. This is what I use for the grass and the sky. They're the background and the skybox. They're called actually the floor box, I think is what I called it. That is what you see. Next, it's getting kind of rambly, but next tool that you want to look at is lighting. Now this is kind of an interesting one because it doesn't share the index of the other ones. It actually starts at 1 and it goes down from there. If you press right, it'll bring you back to 0. The index of lighting goes between 0 and 1 in increments of 0.1. So if you go back 1 on index 1, it goes to 0.9, 0.8, 0.7. It's going to be kind of confusing. I'm probably not going to explain it very well, but the easiest way to think about this is the lighting effect of an area is measured as a percentage of light. So 100% lighting means you're just fully seeing something. This whole outside area, this area that I'm walking around in, is 100% lighted. So it's a 1 on the scale. If you wanted to make it a little bit darker, say 90% dark, you would set it to 0.9 and then click. And that would create a patch of darker area in lighting here. These are kind of interesting little bits that you can use to change the lighting of the level, make things look a little bit more dynamic, and actually kind of make the levels look more interesting. So you can see that if I shoot an object through that, it changes the light level of, it changes to the light level that it is underneath. So that's pretty interesting. You'll notice the same here. It kind of gets darker for a second. So that's how you do that. 0 point whatever is what it's going to be set to, and then it'll act like a percentage. So if you wanted something to be pitch black, it goes 0, and it'll be represented by a black box. And you cannot see what it is. You can see out of it. If you were to throw an object into it, it would turn pitch black. Next thing I want to talk about, next tool. The next tool would be type 5. Now 5 is kind of interesting because it's a little bit hard to explain in the sense that there's not, let me check if I'm right about this. Type 5. This is dynamic, right? This is dynamic lighting, right? Let me check. Yeah, this is dynamic lighting. So, dynamic lighting essentially means that you are creating a piece in the level that changes that grid space's lighting depending on the global timer, or whatever thing you program in. The idea behind dynamic lighting is that you are able to program in a kind of like a scripting for what it is. It's a more advanced concept, and at the moment there's only 1 or 2 different types that in this build are used to flicker the lights inside of here. So if you're wondering how that happens, how I do the flickering lights, that's how I did it. The actual programming of dynamic lighting, though, is kind of complicated, and you would have to know a bit more about the engine to be able to do it properly. I will probably create a tutorial for that, though, coming up in one of my later series about making textures and different sprites, and probably more about dynamic lighting. But at the moment, all you need to know is that it changes the lighting, and you probably don't need it if you don't know how to program in specific ways that the lighting is changed. So just kind of ignore it for now. And finally, the last thing was just kind of a placeholder that I created for the object system. Sprites are drawn as objects. Their main idea of them is that they can be tied to a physical object that you can program into the game to represent them in the game. But they're not necessarily very useful in the standard base of the OLFT engine. If I get into the Flight Live engine, I will explain a little bit better about what they can be used for. But just know that right now, if you have an object, just the word object is being used to describe a drawn sprite. It doesn't have any physical properties because the game is programmed only to draw the objects based on what the object variable says. They don't actually have anything about them. One of the nicer things about the objects, though, is there is a built-in function that you can use to tie an object to, say you programmed an object variable that created a bunch of enemies. All you'd have to do is tie that enemy to a specific object, and it will draw an object to represent that enemy. From there, it's basically the same kind of thing, and you're mostly going to just see more repeats of that kind of idea when you're talking about objects. So from there, I don't know if there's much else to describe. Oh, my thing is kind of lagging. Give me a second. I'm going to jump out of this real quick. One last thing before I finish up, I just wanted to add in one of the most important things, actually. So after you made your edits, say you wanted to add a couple blocks or whatever to a level, all that you decided to do. If you want to save this level, it's not going to automatically save if you save the program. It's just a variable within the game, so it wouldn't save between reloads. So if you wanted to actually save it, you'd press the slash key next to the less than or greater than keys, and that would give you this little console pop up. This is basically all the information that's inside the level. What you have to do is you have to copy this by highlighting it all, and make sure that you don't highlight this X for the console. Press Control C, that will copy it, and then if you go into the map variable, this one, line 384, go into the map that you want to edit. In this case, I would say it would be intersection on this one. Go to here. Notice that there's a whole section called name, player, direction. Ignore those for now. What you want to replace is this, from this point that's called enemies, all the way. Let me just close these last few. Lighting, default lighting, these are all the different things that determine how the level is drawn, but you don't need to know about them really. All that really matters is that you're copying these from what the game gives you. So it goes from that to that, from enemies to ceiling layout. If you copy that from the console over here, and then you paste it into here, you end up with the level that you saved being actually saved into the game. And if you save this code, from now on, that level that you edited will be this level that you've saved. And anytime you reload the program, it will come back as that. The other options in this aren't too important right now. I'll probably go into exactly what they do later on in the more advanced tutorial, because these are kind of advanced topics. You've got the color of the sky, the color of the floor, all the custom assets that show the game how you want it to draw each level. And then a whole bunch of other things that you've already saved, and then these three things. These are kind of things that you do actually want to edit at the beginning of the level. The name of it, so if you want to name it, where the player starts, the X and Y position that they always start on whenever the game is loaded, and then the direction they are facing. Now these are all things that are part of a level, like say this one I called 2-4 and another one called test. That's something that will be tied to each level, and everything that you saved will also be tied to the level. So if you want to make a new level, just copy the whole thing, and then change those things, and then copy, paste from the console what you edited, and put it into this. It will be your level, minus a couple of things if you don't know how to change the textures. But that's about it. That's about all you need to know to start programming with this engine. So I'd recommend that you just start messing around with the level editor if you're interested, and then I will start making the next video on more advanced topics like texture making, or how to make different lighting effects, and more of the nitty-gritty about how the game actually works and how you can make it using different templates. And I'll also do a little bit about Flat Life, the weapon system that I added into that, and a couple of the improvements I made to the enemies and pickups, and how that ties into objects. So I bet all that really doesn't make much sense to you right now, but when I get into those topics, they will. One more note that I almost forgot to mention: when you're making the layout of the level, the actual walls, make sure that there aren't any spaces that you can see through. These ones, these walls here, if you notice, the whole game is surrounded by walls. The place that the player can walk inside is surrounded by walls, and that is on purpose, because if you can see through a wall, the game will crash. It will try and draw something that isn't there, and it'll get stuck with what it's trying to do, and you will end up crashing the program. And it'll look like this, and you will lose all your progress because there's no way for you to recover from that. So make sure that you do not leave something open like that, and try not to click outside of the level, because it will also crash it. So aside from that, thanks for watching, and I will keep you guys posted. Thank you.